My name is David Gruskis from RAE and SCRS board member. And today, the Society of Collision Repair Specialists will be presenting spot welding. You have to be aware that sparks can fly if something, so many things that can cause that. But when sparks fly, that weld is no good. So,
and that was my point.
Well, let's talk about what causes sparks to fly. A number of things. First off, most of the technicians out there, they're tips. They'll grind them down, they'll file them down instead of dressing them properly because they're in a rush. If your tips aren't totally perpendicular to your surface, will cause sparks. If the tips are worn at a specific part and allows air to get in, that air gap will increase the resistance. The resistance will create more heat. That heat is going to create blowouts of your weld. So we want to eliminate it. So we want to come in that we're totally perpendicular. We want our tips to be clean and properly dressed and not using a grinder, but whatever that manufacturer requires are the two biggest faults that I see out there with the technicians.
And of course, on a manual setting, you want to make sure that that range is within the parameter of
the bolts too.
Welding.
So from a tip standpoint, I mean, to me, that's a great thing to ask because a lot of times managers, shop owners, they don't get to see how, if the tips are bad or from a maintenance standpoint. Dave, how often should the tips, and again, just from a general aspect of all the manufacturers, how often should they be replaced? Is there a time frame? Is there a usage? What do you look for?
okay, you look for the tips being clean. The quality tips are made of such a high quality material now, that could just be simply with a scuff pad.
Scotch-Brite, something like that, yeah.
The welders, some of them now have counters on them that count down your welds and force you to clean your tips, which is great.
Right.
But again, the proper tip is key. A lot of times the tech will have the proper tip, but it's not what he's used to. He's used to a little bit smaller tip from an old inferior welder. So he puts the wrong tips on the welder to try to just accommodate his,
just move on
to
the
make
next
it work
thing.
right.
Yeah.
You have to keep the welder the way it was designed to work. Another big problem we always see is that, no welders are designed to weld through paint.
Correct.
You're supposed to be cleaning all four sides of your material, and you're supposed to be using the proper weld-through primer. So preparation is 99% of what the weld is 1%.
Now we hear some of the welders advertise that you can go through E-coat.
Right.
Does anybody have an answer? Is that a true statement?
No. E-coat is not electrically conductive. So if some manufacturers do not want you to use weld-through primer in it, and they want you to use the E-coat as the material between the two panels.
Corrosion resistance standpoint.
As for corrosion protection. So what you're going to do is, to create your path, is that they have what is known as a shunt plier. And that shunt plier will be around the first weld. So the electricity will pass through the shunt plier, creating an electrical circuit, which at the tips will now create that weld. And then after that, when you do your second weld, the electricity will pass through the first weld, which will complete the circuit. So shunt pliers are usually a required thing. A lot of guys will just use a pair of vice grips. Problem with vice grips is that they have a small head. The proper shunt pliers will have a copper head and a wide footing.
What is your feeling on maintenance? Is that something you do yourself on maintaining the unit, or are you relying on your distributor? What do these welders take a lot of maintenance?
Yeah, well, yes and no. You know this, but there's a lot of things that we can do internally at our stores. We do rely on our distributor, or we do rely on them to come and take care of it. But yeah, it's because things have gotten to the point that it's hard for all of us, in doing what we do each day, to be able to maintain these things. They're very, very user friendly for what they do, but for us to be able to do this each day, and for us to be able to maintain it, you have to have a partner. You have to have I would say your distributor or whomever you're purchasing from.
Well, to Barry's point, that's why training is so important. Your technician has to know when that tip needs to be dressed or replaced, and that's why it's important that when you purchase a piece of equipment like that, that you go through the paces of making sure your technician knows how to use it.
Yeah.
Well, also when you're purchasing, you want to look at who your distributor is. Are parts available for it? Are they going to service you? Are they going to train you? There's some companies out there that'll sell you the machine, but they don't train you.
Well said.
And how are you
right.
supposed to figure that out? And then there's some machines that some people are selling machines. There's no parts available.
Right.
They'll say the machine and they'll train you, but something goes wrong.
It's on you.
So make sure that you do your due diligence, and that you're dealing with reputable companies that have the ability to service it and have the parts that service it also.
A lot of manufacturers say what kind, actual specifying different manufacturers of spot welders to purchase. So as shops, they should do due diligence in, are they buying a welder to meet a certain specification? Or do they have a plan for a certification program down the road?
Or
that
they generalize their repair.
Right.
Yeah.
That they really should do their homework and do their due diligence on what they purchase. But also to Barry's point on keeping the tips clean.
One point I've got, like with all things, there's options, right? So when you're looking for a spot welder, there's 1,000 different options you can get. David touched on it as far as whether you're looking for an OEM approval or if it's a generalized repair. One of the things I see, there's air cooled and there's liquid cooled. Dave, Toby, I'll leave this up to you too, but is there an advantage or disadvantage to one above the other?
Well, the liquid cooled, it does does many different things, but the two key things is it keeps the transformer cool and keeps the tips cool. So you'll get longevity out of the tips and you'll be able to produce more welds at a higher power faster by keeping it cool. But the big but is we're now mixing liquid and electricity. They don't like working with each other. So the service factor comes in. And there is a tremendous responsibility, on the shop to, I got to keep this clean. I basically have a fish tank cooling my welder.
Yeah.
So service becomes key. Relying on your supplier, relying on your distributor, and just relying on pure maintenance in the shop, to me, becomes key.
It's a culture. It's a culture shift. Toby, option-wise, what do you see? And again, you're interviewing your next spot welder company. What are some of the options that you look for? And again, not necessarily company specific, but options within a spot welder that you want to see. Because obviously you work with this a lot. What are some of the options that you look at?
Most of the welders that come out today are
fully optioned out.
Fully optioned out is
Right.
correct. I mean, they have everything there. Back to your point, though, is that the welders today are virtually all water cooled. I mean, the older machines used to be air cooled, but we've more or less phased those out. So
there's still some around.
But
that was
here's,
kind of my point.
as Dave had pointed out, I was at a shop. They had never changed the coolant. So I'd like, don't you flush your radiator out after so many hours of use or miles of use? Well, same holds true with your
Something you don't think about.
your spot welders. The coolant needs to be replaced. It wears out, as Dave said. So you want to make sure you have somebody there who knows what they're doing, what kind of coolant it is, because some of them have special coolants.
That's a good
And
point.
it's
That's a
not
good
something
point
you
as
just
well.
go, ground, throw some coolant in. They have special coolants that are designed for the spot welders that don't allow corrosion to occur in there, which is a real big problem with it if you're not careful.
Because that coolant is flowing through electric transformers. So the chemical that is going in it is very, very important. It's not simply taking some antifreeze and pouring it in. And I do notice one thing that I've seen on all welders, the newer ones, is there seems to be the counterbalancer to hold the gun, so it makes the gun nice and light for you. but there's a little strap that connects to the gun. And that's actually an insulator between that balancer and the gun. But it's also the first piece that body men seem to take off. And
Right.
that starts a chain reaction of problems. So having due diligence in the shop, whether it's a manager, whether it's a small shop and it's yourself, make sure your equipment's maintained exactly to what the manufacturer requires.
Going back to that selection of making a decision on how to purchase and what type of purchase you should be making, you know, I hear advertisers say, you know, our equipment's upgradable. Can you tell us a little bit about what the upgrades may be?
Okay, well, there's a couple key things right now on welders, on upgradable. There's SD cards in welders, or there's ports to just download upgrades off the internet. Some of the top welders now are actually tracking the tech and the weld, so you'll be able to print and store your weld. So if there's a failure in a car due to many reasons, you can say, yes, I fixed that car properly. If there's a weld that shot sparks everywhere, as we said, and the weld was bad,
You'll know that too.
you'll know that also.
Yeah.
And
Now-
that you took corrective
Yeah.
procedure.
Now, I've heard that these welders are so sophisticated that a tech can tell when they perform a bad weld, and that they can compensate for it by welding right next to that bad weld. Can you elaborate on that?
That's actually true. But again, depending on the type of vehicle, depending on how much did they overheat the metal making that first weld, maybe that point needed a rivet put there.
Right.
Maybe a weld wasn't the proper thing to put next to it. But again, education on the manufacturer's procedure of that vehicle is key. So always get the manufacturer's procedure. A big question that also is coming up a lot because of these complex metals is, are the tips something that's a consumable? What's your opinion of that?
Well, that's a huge issue when you have a third-party payer of what is basically a cost of doing business and what is a consumable. You know, one side of the fence, it's not fair if you buy a tip that does 10 vehicles and you charge that third party the complete cost of the tip. Somewhere along the line, you know, we need to educate all the parties involved and try to get compensated for the wear items. And it's just not in the tips, obviously, it's in other facets of our collision business.
What's your opinion on
Well, any sort of consumable that you can put with the car, that this went with the car, or this was a part of the car, or even a segment of what you used was a part of it. I think that's 100% in line with what you need to do, at least from my aspects, what we do, because clearly it's being used on the vehicle. But to Kai's point, yeah, if you're using it on 50 different vehicles, which you're not going to, but if you did, yeah, I mean that's not fair either. One question I've got, you were talking about updates, or all of us were talking about updates. The shops you go into that you see that are buying, and this is also for you, how often are these machines being updated? I know, cars change each quarter, it seems like, every 60 or 90 days. If they're changing that rapidly, the technology that we're using, the should change as well. If the machine's not being updated yearly, is that odd to you two? I mean,
there should be, the machines are updated at least yearly.
well,
But
the
is
software is,
the
but
software
is,
is.
but clearly is that from what you're seeing, is that happening on the repairer level?
It's not happening on the repair level because it takes a person taking an SD card out, going to the office, sticking it in, getting the update downloaded, and sticking it back in. So unless there's a system in place in that facility that we are going to do our updates as they're available, it seems that the updates to do an estimate are immediate. But as updates come into the equipment, which is going to be more prevalent, whether it's a spot welder or whether it's other welders,
Right.
everything is now being updated at a very rapid rate.
So I guess the question would be, Kai, and this is for you, when you're purchasing a new welder, do you look at, okay, well, does this come with a year's worth of update data? Does this come with 5 years? I mean, I'm trying to think of like when we buy a PC now, that's almost the way you have to look at it. Is it, am I buying pro support for 5 years? Am I buying it for 2? Or are you just buying the machine only and then, you know, you'll deal with the updates later?
Well, as a consumer, you know, that's always the smart thing to do. But unfortunately, in today's market, if you're on a certified program, you don't have a lot of choices. It's that particular welder for that particular OE.
Right.
So, you know, you would hope that that particular manufacturer offers those concessions. A lot of them are very competitive, and obviously will work with the facilities to do what you need to have them do.
Toby, what do you see when you go into a shop and you're doing your interview process before you start your welding or whatever you're doing there? What do you, are the machines being updated? Are you seeing them being updated? I'm just curious for my own knowledge.
I see most of the equipment out there is in average to poor condition. You go out, you look at the tips, you look at how they keep the machines, you look at their consumable drawers. We got to train these people. That, you know, there's an expensive piece of equipment, and it's like your car, it needs to be upgraded and it needs to be maintained.
Right.
And the longer that you continue to do, the longer these machines will run for you. One of the problems is that they don't know what is good and what is bad. So we go back to training and education. Again, the manufacturers of these equipment have good training programs. You know, on the other hand, if you don't have that available to you, the ICAR has a very good class that is available, WCS 04. And when they upgraded the class, you had to have a spot welder. The instructor had to have a spot welder in there to do show them all the procedures with it, how it works, and go through and have some practice with it. One of the things that I'll ask you two gentlemen is that are your people test welding the welds? Are you keeping a record of those spot welds when they do a destructive test? In case there is a future problem that you need to justify it.
Sure.
I can answer that. In our facility, we do a test panel with the same material that we're using on the vehicle. It's a line item charge that we put on the estimate and on our bill. And it's a situation where we do keep that coupon or that test panel as long as the vehicle's in the shop. But we do discard it. We just do not have enough capacity to store every panel.
Good question. Yeah, up till, I love to say we've been doing it the entire time, but up to you came, we're actually we do a test panel now, but it's a small one. We're able to purchase the small pieces, or we use what's on the car or an old piece that came off the car if we don't have the exact type, and then we keep that in the RO, and so that way I'm not storing it. But it's what, to Dave's point earlier, that the software can now track that. That may be something that, as far as our side, that we may not take that additional step of keeping it because I have the ability now to pull it up from a software standpoint.
I wanted to backtrack just a little bit, Toby. When you obviously see a lot of shops when you're out there doing your training. Do you find that this equipment is shop owned or technician owned, and whether or not that pays a difference in the maintenance of the product?
Well, the spot welders are shop owned. Where I see the difference is a lot of shops on a MIG welder will be owned by the technicians, and usually they're in pretty good shape compared to the ones that are owned by the shop.
Mm-hmm. That's right, trying to allude to that.
And again, these guys don't know what is good, what is bad. I mean, there's a pair of MIG pliers to clean out. We're getting back into a different area, but just to make the point is that these pliers will clean off the inside of the nozzle. What do most technicians do? They'll take the gun and go bang, 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 and they don't realize is that they're breaking down the gun, and then you start to see the tape around the nozzle and around the handles and so forth. They continue to go that route, and not knowing how to maintain it and not having the tools to maintain it creates another problem. So you go back to these machines, biggest problem is the tips. And, you know, they don't know how to dress them properly. Like you said, you can use a Scotch-Brite, light sandpaper, but using a grinder on them, you know, oh, it's close enough.
And it's quicker
Right.
in their aspect
Well,
from that point of view.
But it seems the key is have the proper electric. And when we're researching the welders, do our homework on what is the OE spec, what is my future plans, so I make a proper educated decision and have the proper service. Once I own it, take care of it. Service the liquid material.
Maintenance schedule.
Now, and one point I wanted to bring up before we end is a lot of guys have said, well, I have an older welder and it's not as powerful, so I'll only do panels. But I'm being told the new metals the panels are being made of
Can't get through it.
require very fast, very low heat to make the weld. And the worst thing you could be doing is using an antiquated welder. So just because these welders are more powerful for thicker material, that doesn't mean that you don't need that same technology to simply do a thin panel. Because the material on the vehicles that's thinner is harder, and the one thing all the metals have in common is they hate heat. Hopefully, this gave you a great overview on what to look for in purchasing, in maintaining, and general housekeeping in your shop on spot welding. Again, this is the Society of Collision Repair Specialists. You could find us at scrs.com.